lonely rancher rescued a family lost in a sandstorm and found the peace. He'd been searching for. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters change our lives forever. Today's story takes us to the unforgiving American frontier of 1885, where a man, haunted by his past, stumbles upon a family in desperate need. What starts as a simple rescue becomes a journey of redemption, healing, and the discovery that sometimes saving others is the first step to saving ourselves. Before we begin, if you already enjoy this type of content, leave a like to support me. The horizon had turned an ominous shade of amber, and Thomas Brennan knew what that meant. After 15 years wandering the Western Territories, he'd learned to read the desert's moods like a preacher reads scripture. The wind carried more than dust. It carried the promise of a sandstorm that would swallow everything in its path. Thomas pulled his weathered hat low over his eyes and urged his horse, Dakota, toward the rocky outcropping he'd spotted earlier. The animal's ears flicked nervously as the first gusts of sand-laden wind began to whip around them. At 40, Thomas had survived more storms than he cared to count, but this one felt different, bigger, angrier. The weight of his past pressed down on him like the approaching storm clouds. 3 years had passed since he'd lost everything that mattered: his wife Emma to fever, his young son Jacob to the same cruel disease that had swept through their small Kansas town. Since then, he'd been drifting from settlement to settlement, taking odd jobs, never staying long enough to form attachments. The guilt of surviving when they hadn't eaten at him daily. As the first wall of sand hit, Thomas dismounted and led Dakota into a shallow cave between the rocks. The howling wind outside sounded like the voices of the damned, and for a moment, he wondered if this was how his story would end, alone in a cave, buried by the desert's fury. Maybe that would be fitting justice. But then, through the deafening roar of the storm, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A child's cry, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind. Thomas pressed himself against the cave opening, straining to hear over the storm's rage. There it was, again, desperate, terrified, human. Without hesitation, Thomas wrapped his bandana around his face and stepped back into the maelstrom. The sand hit him like 1,000 tiny needles, but he pressed forward, following the sound. Dakota whinnied in protest as Thomas led him deeper into the storm, but the horse trusted his master's judgment. The cries grew louder, more distinct. Now he could hear a woman's voice too, calling out in panic. Thomas pushed through the blinding sand, his hand on Dakota's reins, serving as his anchor to reality. The storm seemed determined to claim them all, but Thomas had found something worth fighting for: the chance to save someone else, even if he couldn't save himself. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Thomas spotted the dark outline of a covered wagon tilted at a dangerous angle. One wheel had broken, and the canvas cover flapped violently in the wind. The horses that had been pulling it were nowhere to be seen, likely fled in terror when the storm hit. If you're enjoying the video so far, a like and subscribe to the channel really helps. Thomas tied Dakota's reins to the wagon's side and fought his way to the back. Inside, he found them, a woman in her 30s with auburn hair, clutching two children, a boy who couldn't be more than 8, and a girl perhaps 5 years old. Their eyes were wide with terror, and sand had already begun to accumulate inside the wagon despite their efforts to seal the openings. "Ma'am," Thomas shouted over the storm, "we need to get you to shelter. This wagon won't hold." The woman looked up at him with a mixture of relief and suspicion. In this lawless territory, a stranger could be salvation or damnation. But with sand pouring in and the wagon creaking ominously, she had little choice. "My children," she called back. "I won't leave without them. I'll help you carry them." Thomas reached for the little girl, who shrank back in fear. "Trust me, I know where there's shelter." The woman, Margaret, she told him later, made the hardest decision of her life in that moment. She nodded and gathered the boy in her arms, while Thomas lifted the girl. Together, they abandoned the wagon and fought their way through the storm toward the rocky outcropping. The journey back to the cave felt endless. The little girl buried her face in Thomas's chest, her small body trembling with each gust of wind. The boy walked between his mother and Thomas, holding tight to both their hands. Step by step, they battled the desert's fury, a makeshift family united by desperation and hope. When they finally reached the cave, Thomas helped them settle in the deepest corner, away from the wind and sand. He used his supplies to create a barrier at the cave mouth, while Dakota stood stoically, providing an additional windbreak. For the first time in hours, they could hear each other speak without shouting. As the storm raged outside, Thomas looked at the family he'd rescued and felt something stir in his chest, something he thought had died with Emma and Jacob. It was the smallest spark of purpose, the faintest echo of the man he used to be. He didn't know their story yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let the desert claim them. Not while he still drew breath. The sandstorm raged for 6 hours, turning day into night, and night into an amber nightmare. Inside the cave, Thomas worked methodically to make the space more comfortable for his unexpected guests. He shared his water sparingly, rationed out hardtack and jerky, and used his spare shirt to create a softer place for the children to rest. Margaret watched him with cautious gratitude. Her husband, she explained in whispered conversations, had died of a snakebite 2 days earlier while they were traveling to California. She'd been trying to reach the next settlement when the storm hit, but the horses had bolted when the first wind struck. "I'm Margaret Conway," she said, her voice still hoarse from shouting over the storm. "These are my children, Benjamin and little Catherine." Thomas nodded, noting how the boy, Benjamin, kept a protective arm around his sister. At 8 years old, he was already trying to be the man of the family. It reminded Thomas painfully of himself at that age, when his own father had died in a mining accident. "Thomas Brennan," he replied simply. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. Your husband was a good man to bring you this far." As the night wore on, the children gradually warmed to Thomas. Catherine, despite her initial fear, was drawn to Dakota, who had proven to be gentle with children during Thomas's travels. The horse allowed her to pet his nose, and even shared his feed bag with tiny hands. Benjamin, meanwhile, peppered Thomas with questions about frontier life, his young mind already trying to understand the responsibilities that had suddenly fallen on his shoulders. "Will the storm ever end?" Catherine asked, her voice small in the darkness. Thomas knelt beside her, his voice gentle but honest. "It will, little one. Storms always end. But while we wait, we stay together and keep each other safe." Margaret caught his eye over the children's heads, and he saw her own fear reflected there. She was a city woman. Her soft hands and clean dress spoke of a life far removed from the harsh realities of frontier survival. The loss of her husband had left her not just widowed, but completely unprepared for the challenges ahead. As the children finally fell asleep, Thomas and Margaret talked in low voices about practical matters. Her wagon was likely destroyed or buried by now. Even if they could find it, the broken wheel made it unusable. Her supplies were limited, and she had only a handful of silver coins to her name. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Margaret admitted, her composure finally cracking. "David handled everything: the horses, the route, the money. I don't even know how far we are from the next town." Thomas studied her face in the flickering light of his small campfire. He saw determination beneath the fear, strength hidden under the grief. This was a woman who would do whatever it took to protect her children, even if she didn't yet know what that meant. "Millfield is about 2 days' ride northeast," he said. "It's a decent settlement, with a school and a church. People there will help a widow with children. Leave a comment about what you think of this story so far." Margaret nodded, but Thomas could see the questions in her eyes. How would they make the journey, with 1 horse and 3 people? What would she do once they reached Millfield? How could she provide for her children in a world that showed little mercy to the unprepared? Thomas found himself making calculations he hadn't made in years. His own supplies, stretched carefully, could last them the journey. Dakota was strong enough to carry Margaret and Catherine while he and Benjamin walked. It would be difficult, but not impossible. But the real question wasn't whether they could make the journey, was what Thomas would do afterward. For 3 years, he'd avoided any situation that might require him to care about other people's welfare. Caring meant the possibility of loss, and he'd already lost more than any man should have to bear. Yet as he watched Catherine sleep peacefully, for the first time since the storm began, and saw Benjamin's young face relaxed in dreams, Thomas felt the walls around his heart beginning to crack. These children needed protection, guidance, and hope for the future. Margaret needed someone who understood the frontier, someone who could help her navigate this unforgiving world. Morning came gradually, the storm's fury finally exhausting itself as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas ventured outside first, checking to ensure the air was clear. The landscape had been transformed, familiar landmarks buried under feet of sand. The very shape of the desert altered by the storm's passage. When he returned to wake the others, he found Margaret already awake, watching her children sleep. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and her dress was wrinkled and stained. But there was something different about her expression. The paralyzing fear of the night before had been replaced by quiet determination. "What happens now, Mr. Brennan?" she asked. Thomas looked at her, then at the children, then out at the transformed landscape beyond the cave. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't thinking about his own pain or his desire to disappear into the vastness of the frontier. Instead, he was thinking about responsibility, about the future, about what Emma would want him to do. "Now, we get you and your children to safety," he said. "And then we figure out what comes next." It was a simple answer, but Thomas knew it represented something much more complex. The first step back toward the man he used to be. The first movement away from the abyss of grief that had swallowed him whole. The desert had taken much from all of them, but it had also brought them together. Sometimes, Thomas reflected, the cruelest storms carry the most unexpected gifts. The journey to Millfield began at first light, with the desert still bearing the scars of the previous nights. Fury, Thomas had fashioned a makeshift shelter on Dakota's back, using canvas salvaged from Margaret's destroyed wagon, creating space for both Margaret and Catherine to ride while he and Benjamin walked alongside. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed free of dust by the storm's passage. Catherine rode in front of her mother, her small hands gripping Dakota's mane while she pointed excitedly at the transformed landscape. To her, this was an adventure. She didn't yet understand the of their situation. Benjamin, however, walked with the serious demeanor of someone forced to grow up too quickly. He stayed close to Thomas, asking practical questions about tracking direction, finding water, and reading the weather. Thomas found himself answering with the patience he'd once shown his own son, sharing knowledge passed down from his father and learned through hard experience. "Why do you help us?" Benjamin asked as they crested a small rise. The question was direct, without the diplomatic cushioning adults might use. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because everyone deserves help when they need it most." "Did someone help you when you needed it?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. He remembered those dark days after the fever took Emma and Jacob, when well-meaning neighbors offered casseroles and empty platitudes, but couldn't fill the gaping hole in his life. He'd pushed them all away, preferring isolation to the pain of human connection. "No," Thomas admitted. "I was too stubborn to let them." As they traveled, Margaret proved more resilient than her city upbringing suggested. She never complained about the heat or the dust, rationed water carefully, and kept Catherine entertained with stories and songs. Thomas noticed how she watched him interact with Benjamin, observing his teaching methods and gentle corrections. By midday, they'd covered impressive ground, but the real test came when they encountered their first obstacle, a deep wash that the storm had carved across their path. The erosion was fresh and steep, impossible for Dakota to navigate safely while carrying passengers. "We'll need to find another way around," Thomas said, studying the terrain. The detour would add miles to their journey and eat into their limited supplies. "What about there?" Benjamin pointed to a spot where the wash narrowed slightly. "Could we build a bridge?" Thomas looked where the boy pointed, then at Benjamin with new respect. "That's good thinking, son. Let's see what we can do." Working together, they gathered fallen branches and rocks exposed by the storm. Thomas showed Benjamin how to test the stability of their makeshift bridge, while Margaret and Catherine gathered smaller stones to fill gaps. It was exhausting work under the desert sun, but Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of solving problems as part of a team. If this content is being helpful, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support me. When they finally crossed safely, Catherine clapped her hands in delight. And even Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her. Benjamin beamed with pride at having contributed to their solution, and Thomas realized the boy was learning more than just frontier survival skills. He was learning that he could be part of something larger than himself. As afternoon turned to evening, they made camp in a sheltered spot beside a small spring Thomas remembered from previous travels. While Margaret tended the children, Thomas hunted and managed to bring down a rabbit, providing them with fresh meat for the first time since the storm. Around the campfire that night, their conversation gradually moved beyond immediate survival concerns. Margaret spoke about her life in St. Louis, where she'd met her husband David at a church social. He'd been a dreamer, convinced that California held the promise of a better life for their growing family. He was always optimistic, Margaret said, her voice soft with memory. Even when things were difficult, he believed tomorrow would be better. Thomas found himself sharing stories of Emma and Jacob, memories he'd kept locked away for 3 years. He told them about Jacob's fascination with horses, how the boy would spend hours drawing pictures of Dakota and the other animals they encountered. He spoke of Emma's herb garden, her belief that every plant had a purpose, and every problem had A solution if you just looked hard enough. As the fire burned down to embers, Catherine fell asleep against Thomas's shoulder, her small hand clutching his shirt. The trust implicit in that gesture moved him deeply. Benjamin sat close by, whittling a piece of wood with Thomas's spare knife, while Margaret watched them all with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. "You're good with them," Margaret said quietly, when she was sure the children couldn't hear. "They trust you." "Children are honest judges of character," Thomas replied. "They haven't learned to hide their feelings yet. Have you thought about what you'll do after we reach Millfield?" The question Thomas had been avoiding all day hung in the air between them. He'd been drifting for 3 years, taking odd jobs and moving on, before anyone could expect commitment or emotional investment. But these past 2 days had reminded him of what it felt like to be needed, to have a purpose beyond mere survival. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't planned much beyond getting you there safely." Margaret nodded, understanding more than she said. They were both running from loss, both trying to figure out how to build new lives from the wreckage of their old ones. The difference was that she had her children to anchor her to the future, while Thomas had only his memories and his guilt. As they settled down for the night, Thomas lay awake, staring at the stars. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past or trying to escape from it. Instead, he found himself wondering about tomorrow, about Millfield, about what kind of life might be possible for a man who'd forgotten how to hope. The desert around them was quiet now, peaceful in a way that felt like forgiveness. Whatever tomorrow brought, Thomas knew he was no longer the same man who'd ridden into that sandstorm. The storm had stripped away more than just the familiar landscape. It had begun to erode the walls he'd built around his heart, grain by grain. Like wind sculpting stone, Millfield appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its wooden buildings and church spire wavering in the afternoon heat. After 2 grueling days of travel, the sight of civilization brought mixed emotions to the small group. Relief at reaching safety, uncertainty about what came next, and for Thomas, a growing reluctance to say goodbye to the family that had become so important to him. The town was larger than Thomas had remembered, with new buildings and a sense of prosperity that spoke well for its future. They rode down the main street slowly, drawing curious glances from townspeople who recognized the signs of travelers who'd survived hard circumstances. Thomas guided them to the boarding house run by Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, a widow in her 60s, known for her kindness to families in need. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, but her eyes were warm as she took in the small group standing on her porch. "Mercy," she said, looking at their dust-covered clothes and weary faces. "You folks look like you've been through a trial. Come in, come in. There's hot water for washing and soup on the stove." As Margaret explained their circumstances, Thomas found himself studying the town through the boarding house windows. Millfield had a school, several shops, a doctor's office, and the kind of community structure that could support a widow with children. It was exactly what Margaret needed: stability, opportunity, and neighbors who would look out for her family. But as he watched Benjamin help Catherine wash her face in the basin Mrs. Walsh provided, Thomas felt an unexpected reluctance to leave. Over the past 3 days, he'd begun to remember what it felt like to be part of a family, to have people depend on him for more than just physical survival. If you liked this video, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. That evening, over a proper meal in the boarding house dining room, Margaret discussed her options with Mrs. Walsh. The older woman knew of several respectable positions that might suit an educated woman: teaching at the school, keeping books for the general store, or helping the doctor's wife with her correspondence and household management. "The important thing," Mrs. Walsh said, "is that you're not alone anymore. This town takes care of its own, especially when children are involved." Thomas excused himself after dinner and walked the streets of Millfield, considering his own future. He could continue his wandering, find work at one of the ranches outside town, or perhaps sign on with a cattle drive heading north. The old restlessness was there, the familiar urge to move on before relationships could deepen and create new opportunities for loss. But as he passed the schoolhouse and saw children playing in the yard, he thought of Benjamin's eager questions and Catherine's trusting smile. He thought of Margaret's quiet strength and the way she'd handled every challenge with grace and determination. Somewhere during their journey, they'd stopped being strangers he was helping and become people he cared about. The next morning brought practical discussions about Margaret's immediate needs. Thomas used some of his own savings to help her purchase appropriate clothing and supplies for her children. He spoke with the schoolmaster about Benjamin's education and arranged for Catherine to attend the informal classes Mrs. Walsh held for younger children. "You don't have to do all this," Margaret said as they walked back from the general store. You've already done more than enough. I want to, Thomas replied, surprising himself with the honesty of the statement. These past few days, they've reminded me of who I used to be, who I want to be again. Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Then stay, she said simply. Millfield needs good men. The children need. We all need people we can count on. The invitation hung between them, weighted with possibility and hope. Thomas looked at Margaret really, looked at her and saw not just a woman in need of rescue, but someone who understood loss and healing. Someone who'd found the courage to build something new from broken pieces. I've been running for 3 years, Thomas admitted. I told myself it was because I didn't want to get hurt again. But maybe I was just afraid of discovering I wasn't worth staying for. You are, Margaret said quietly. You showed us that every day we traveled together. That afternoon, Thomas found himself at the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, standing among the weathered headstones and thinking about Emma and Jacob. For the first time in 3 years, the memory of them brought more comfort than pain. He realized that honoring their memory didn't require him to stop living. It required him to live in a way that would make them proud. When he returned to town, he sought out the local blacksmith, a man named Harris who'd been looking for a partner to help expand his business. The work was honest and necessary, the kind of trade that built communities, rather than just passing through them. 2 weeks later, Thomas had rented a small house on the edge of Millfield and begun the process of putting down roots. Margaret had secured a position helping Dr. Bradley's wife with her medical practice correspondence, using her education and neat handwriting to organize patient records and handle the business side of the practice. Benjamin thrived in school, his natural intelligence and curiosity making him a favorite of the teacher. Catherine bloomed like a desert flower after rain, making friends easily and bringing joy to everyone around her with her infectious laughter. On Sunday evenings, Thomas often joined the Conway family for dinner at their small apartment above Mrs. Walsh's boarding house. They'd share stories of their week, plan small adventures for the children, and gradually build the foundation of something that felt remarkably like family. What was your favorite part? Leave a comment below, and let's talk about it. One evening, as they watched Benjamin teach Catherine to play checkers, Margaret said, "Do you ever regret staying? You could have kept traveling, seen more of the country." Thomas considered the question seriously. "I've seen enough empty horizons," he said finally. "I'd rather help build something lasting here." As winter approached and the first cold winds began to blow across the desert, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. A chance encounter in a sandstorm had given him back his purpose, his hope, and his faith in the possibility of new beginnings. The peace he'd been searching for hadn't come from running away from his grief, but from learning to carry it alongside new love, new responsibility, and new hope. Sometimes the storms that seem most destructive are actually clearing the way for something better, washing away what's broken to make room for what might grow. In Millfield, surrounded by the family he'd rescued and been rescued by in return, Thomas Brennan finally understood that home isn't a place you find, it's something you build, one day at a time, with the people who matter most. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. I love hearing your opinions and answering your questions. Which part touched you the most? Let me know in the comments and let's discuss it. If you're not subscribed yet, take this opportunity to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next